how limited he is? And you're like, I don't want to be Aquaman. Superman. He's so powerful, right? I mean, this guy, he's faster than a speeding bullet. He's more powerful than a locomotive. He can leap tall buildings in a single bound. Can you imagine? To have the ability to fly, to have not only X-ray vision, but heat vision as well. And then there's that cool cold breath thing that he brings out every once in a while. You're like, what? This guy is amazing. Superman is super cool. He's so powerful. But most of us are familiar with the story. We know that while he's very powerful, he's not all powerful. We know that Superman has a vulnerability. Having come from Krypton, somehow he's susceptible to the radiation that kryptonite emits. And it renders him a weakling. Right? He doesn't know what to do. He can't do anything when kryptonite is around him. It's craziness, right? So we're in the book of Ecclesiastes. And we're getting to this place where Solomon he's told us a lot about life under the sun. He's given us all sorts of counsel and wisdom and truth and insight. And he's told us the way things are under the sun. He's based it on the wisdom that God has given him, his own personal experience, his own learning. And we've been seeing this all the way through. And now, as we get to this week, we'll finish up chapter 9 and get through chapter 10. And we're beginning to see that he's starting to put it all together. He's starting to paint the full picture that he's been painting is starting to come into view. And as we said from the very first week, we won't understand the book of Ecclesiastes in its entirety until we get to the final week. So no one message, while they do stand alone in and of themselves, no one message is the whole story of Ecclesiastes. You have to hold on until you see the whole thing. But what we find with Ecclesiastes is this teaching, perpetual teaching about wisdom and how beneficial wisdom is on planet Earth, as he calls it, under the sun. And wisdom is very powerful for us in this life. Wisdom gives us guidance. Wisdom offers us foresight. Wisdom provides protection. Wisdom gives strength. Wisdom makes us judicious. And as we saw 2 weeks ago, if we want to be happy, we need to be wise. When we pursue happiness in and of itself, it will elude us. But when we pursue wisdom, what we find buried with wisdom is the treasure of happiness. So wisdom, like Superman, is very powerful, but wisdom, like Superman, also has a vulnerability. Here under the sun, wisdom has its kryptonite. Wisdom, while it is extremely necessary for you and I, if we're not careful, we can give it up. So our big idea this morning is that folly is wisdom's kryptonite. Folly is wisdom's kryptonite. Now, 2 weeks ago, we defined this word wisdom as it comes from God in this way. We defined it out of the Life Application Study Bible, and it's that wisdom is the ability to see life from God's perspective and then be able to choose the best course of action. So that's a really simple definition of wisdom. The idea is that we're on this linear plane, this horizontal plane on planet Earth, and from that perspective, it's very difficult to know what's coming. It's very difficult to know the best course of action. You simply can't tell what to do next often. But when we have wisdom from God, it grants us the ability to have some elevation gain. We're able to get some altitude and be able to see things from a different perspective, from God's perspective, and then we can see what's the best course of action here. Friends, we need wisdom. But then there's this idea of folly, and folly is wisdom's kryptonite. And folly is, as defined, It's the quality of being rash or being foolish. To be rash means to be hasty. So one of the Proverbs says that it's not good to be hasty and miss the way. It's to be in a hurry. Oftentimes folly is defined by a lack of admirable traits. So folly is often defined as a lack of attentiveness or carefulness or prudence or forethought or maturity. And as the title of the message goes, a little goes a long way. A little folly goes a long way. The key verse from all of our text is from chapter 10, verse 1, and it's the second half of it. And it says, a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Now, we don't like that to be true. In fact, we don't want that to be true. We want wisdom and honor to outweigh folly. But on planet Earth, that's not actually the way it is. And we could rail against it, and we could cry against it, and we could bemoan it, but the fact is, it is what it is. On planet Earth, folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Remember the joke that we used to tell when we were in elementary school? We'd ask our friend real quick, which is heavier, a pound of feathers or a pound of lead? And if they weren't paying attention, they'd say a pound of lead. And you go, oh, I gotcha. A pound of feathers and a pound of lead weighs the same. It's a pound. But when it comes to wisdom and honor, as compared to folly, the reality of life on earth is that a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. So, you actually could have 2,000 pounds, 1 ton of wisdom and honor, and 1 pound of folly will outweigh it. If you put them on a teeter-totter, you put wisdom and honor on one side, and that's 2,000 pounds of wisdom and honor. And then you put the 1 pound of folly on the other side, and wisdom and honor are left with their feet dangling in the air. And again, we don't like that to be true. We don't want it to be true. And part of the reason we don't want that to be true is because we know ourselves. And we know that we're not just susceptible to folly, we're prone to it. We know it. Even for those of us who have traveled through life a little bit and acquired some wisdom and knowledge and become mature in our faith and in life, we still know we're prone to it. And it scares us that we could acquire all sorts of wisdom and honor and just a little bit of folly could wreck it. A little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. And this is one of those messages that it's like, Solomon gives us this message to scare us. Like that's his purpose in this message, is to get us to feel a sense of angst in our souls, like, oh man, I better be careful. Precisely. That's precisely right. We'd better be careful. Because in this life, folly is wisdom's kryptonite. Okay? So, in this passage, we're going to see folly. We're going to see folly in what we'll call forgetfulness. We're going to see it in negligence. We're going to see it in poor judgment. And we're going to see it in immaturity. So let's take it in stride. Turn with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 9, starting in verse 13. This first section here, he says, I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though a poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Chapter 10, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. So the first thing that we see here in this first section is that folly is forgetful, and it erases good. Now, all of us are forgetful in the sense that, we forgot where we placed our phone, or we misplaced our keys, or we didn't check the calendar in time and we're late for an appointment. That's not the sort of forgetfulness that Solomon is talking about here. If you notice from the story that he gives us, he says, I've seen an example of wisdom. And he tells this story about, and it's an example, it's a story that really is truly impressed him. Remember, Solomon's the king. He's the king of Israel, and it's quite a dynasty at the point in which he's leading, and he's handing this down. Remember, his initial and primary audience is his own son, and then his subjects, those in his kingdom, and he's saying, I saw an example that really impressed me, an example of wisdom. And he tells this story about this little bitty city and this great powerful king that came against it, and then there was this poor wise man in that city who exercised his wisdom and so saved that city. And Solomon says this is really important, but if you remember from the story, we're told that the people in the city who were saved by the wisdom of the poor man just decided not to remember the poor man. They decided not to remember him, and it wasn't like, we misplaced our keys, because verse 16 tells us that they despised his words. The very words that saved the city are now despised. And so folly is forgetful, not in the sense that, I forgot where I placed my phone. Folly is forgetful in that it disregards known wisdom. That's when we say they chose to disregard it. They despised it. And now we know there's big trouble, because the example of wisdom includes the effects of folly here. We just saw last week that the strongest army does not always win the battle. That's the way it is in life on planet Earth. The strongest army does not always win the battle, and here we're given an example as to why. Because sometimes wisdom can be exercised to the extent that it overcomes the powerful, which is pretty cool, right? But no one in the town remembered the poor man or what he had done for them because of their own folly. And when wisdom is disregarded, its benefits are lost. This is true, friends, for a country. When a country is founded on wise principles and those principles are disregarded, we're in trouble. This is true of a church. When a church is founded on wise principles and then over time those principles are allowed to be eroded, we're in trouble. And that's true in a household as well. Right? The example of wisdom includes the effects of folly. And the wisdom that saved that little city in the past was not being regarded in the present. And so we know their future is doomed. Folly is wisdom's kryptonite. We see the value of wisdom includes its vulnerability. Here we're told that that wisdom is better than might, strength, power. It's more powerful than weapons of war. It can drown out. Wisdom can drown out the shouting of a foolish ruler. And yet all it takes, final line in chapter 9, all it takes is one sinner to undo a whole bunch of good. Oh my goodness, we just don't want that to be. But it is what it is. To destroy here means to do away with, to cause the destruction or the undoing of something. So so one sinner, it says, can undo. Somebody could spend all sorts of time doing lots of good, building up, making something great, and one person with one act of foolishness can come around and ruin it. You think, that is just terrible. It is. That's why we're supposed to be super careful, because folly is wisdom's kryptonite. The weight of wisdom is no match for folly. We don't want that to be true, but it is. Verse 1 tells us this, gives us this little story about dead flies making the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. It's like, who wants to eat soup when they found a fly in it? If you do, you're kind of odd, right? And so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. It would be like this. Let's pretend that my favorite cookies are no-bake cookies. And you have to add peanut butter to it because that's the right, just, and fair thing to do. When it comes to no-bake cookies, the chocolate and the peanut butter come together, and there's just something very magical about that, okay? So let's say, I don't know of any woman that's a part of City Point Church whose name is Gertrude, so I got to make up names so I don't point any fingers. Let's say that Gertrude came and decided that she wanted to do some good, a lot of good. And she decided that she was going to make me my favorite cookies every week for the next 4 months, which I'm not baiting any of you to think, hey, maybe we'll make them. I don't need any of those. I like them, but I don't need them. So this is, when you hear the rest of the story, you'll probably refrain from it anyway. So Gertrude's going to do this. And Gertrude makes me cookies every week for the next 4 months. You're like, wow, that was special. That's a lot of good. But then at the end of the 4 months, she has a confession. And she says, you know, Brent, I hope you enjoyed those cookies all of those weeks, but I have something to tell you. There was 1 week in there that I really did not like your sermon. So when I was making your cookies that week, I spit in the dough. Friends, all of the good that Gertrude had built up just got undone. I don't even know which week it was. Right? The weight of wisdom is no match for folly. A little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Now let's take it to a real heavy example, a painfully heavy example. Let's say there's a couple that's married for 10 years. That's 87,600 hours. 87,600 hours. And let's say one of those spouses is faithful for 87,599 hours. And then in 1 hour, they choose not to be. They have undone 87,600 hours. A little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. I'm not saying there's no recovery. But friends, this is the sort of message that is supposed to scare us. It's supposed to scare us straight because we recognize how much is at stake. Wisdom has its kryptonite, and it's called folly. And folly disregards wisdom. And it erases a lot of good. So then we get this in verse 2. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. And you think, what in the world does that mean? How does that have any tie-in? Well, again, this is wisdom literature, and all of these things tie together. It's just without knowing the context and the historical setting, we don't know. So here's what this is meaning. He's recognizing that in that context, the right side of a person was the side of strength. It was the side of power. It was the side of authority. We get this in biblical literature all over. Where's Jesus seated? The right hand of God. It's the position of strength and authority. And so he says the wise man's heart inclines him to the right, where he wore his sword so that he could defend himself. But a man who's foolish inclines to the left, where he's vulnerable, and he just thinks, oh, it's kind of will never happen to me. The dumbest thing ever thought. Right? Knowing that you're vulnerable to folly is really smart so that you can guard yourself against it. Thinking that you're not vulnerable to folly is a setup for walking right into it. So then he says in verse 3, even when a fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he's a fool. It's like he's inclined to the left. He's walking down the road, and you can see him a mile away. You can see it a mile away going, oh my goodness, this guy is in for a train wreck. I know we're not supposed to think people are idiots, but I've seen a couple. You have too. Solomon's writing about them, so we know they exist. He's saying, this man is saying to everyone, the fool is saying to everyone, by the way he's acting, that he's a fool. But then here's what's interesting. Boy, we've got to get this. In verse 4, let's read it. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. Here's what's interesting. If you're paying attention, you'll notice that this is actually the only verse in this whole section that's instructive. We get this example of wisdom, and we're told these things, and we got these proverbial statements. But verse 4 is the only instructive verse in the whole section. He's now instructing us regarding the forgetfulness of folly and how it erases good. How is that? Now, we're told if the anger of the ruler rises against you, we're not told whether or not the ruler's anger is justified or whether he's just throwing a tantrum. But given that the last verse was about a fool and how it just is one by the way he acts, we could have a pretty strong supposition, like we could conclude that that because of the prior verse, that the ruler's anger is justified because he's seen foolish behavior in his kingdom. In fact, somebody who works for him has been foolish, is what he's saying. A person's foolish behavior has stirred the king's anger, is what we get the sense of, and we're meant to see ourselves in it. Because when we play the part of the fool, when we give ourselves to foolishness, it's no wonder people get angry. Right? The person forgot wisdom. They forgot it. They disregarded wisdom and they acted foolishly and they caused damage. They undid good that the king had been building up. And it angered him. So now Solomon says, what do you do? What do you do when you've given yourself to folly, you've undone good, and people are angry at you? What are you supposed to do? This is the only instructive verse. You know what he says? Do not leave your place. Do not leave your place. For calmness will lay great offenses to rest. Interesting, huh? See, because typically when we recognize that we've played the part of the fool, we've acted foolishly, we have a sense of guilt and shame, and we want to take our balls and we want to go home with our tails tucked. And we just think, man, I have so blown it. I'm going to run. And Solomon says, that's not the right response. He says, do not leave your place. Hold steady. Show a calmness, a meekness, if you will. That's the right response. And when the ruler sees that, they will be far more inclined to let that offense go than if you try to rationalize or justify why it happened, or if you just quit. And so we have this great reality that though the weight of wisdom is no match for folly, we're instructed to show meekness in the face of our own folly, and we will benefit from it. Now turn that Godward. That's true on a human plane. That the ruler, whether it's a parent or a boss or whoever, they're going to be more inclined to respond favorably to you and overlook that offense if you're meek and calm than if you justify and rationalize. Now stand before God. Every single one of us have played the part of the fool. Every single one of us have embraced folly in lots of ways, disregarding the very wisdom that God has planted in our souls. We've undone all sorts of good, and we stand before God. And what does God say? Don't leave your place. Stand there. Why? Because he's merciful. Because he's gracious. Because if you stand there in calmness, in meekness, Jesus said, blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. Right? Stand there and receive the mercy of God. Stand there and receive his rebuke. Stand there and receive his forgiveness. Stand there and receive grace. Folly is forgetful. It disregards wisdom, and it undoes a lot of good, but it doesn't have to be the end of the story. Now, we're beginning to see how wisdom has its kryptonite and its folly, and forgetfulness it'll undo a lot of good. Now, let's read the next set of verses and see where this goes. Verse 5. There is an evil that I've seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I've seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt, and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. So we've got this two sets of teachings here in these verses, and they both talk about negligence. Folly is negligent, and it is expensive. That's for sure. Right? There is an evil, he says. So we looked at this word last week. Evil here means troubling or disturbing. He's saying, I have seen something that is troubling on planet Earth. It's disturbing, and it has to do with rulers. And he calls it an error that proceeds from rulers. When leaders do what he's saying, he said, that's evil, that's troubling, and it's disturbing. And so he's talking about negligence in leadership, and it's expensive for those who are being led. This evil is witnessed in a twofold error. First, when rulers make the mistake of promoting people who are not competent to the job that's at hand, that, he says, is troubling. And the other side of it is when he or she, that ruler, fails to promote people who have proven worth. He says that's a twofold error. And when that happens, the leader is negligent, and those they lead will suffer. Why? Because people who are having places of prominence and places of authority are not qualified to run or lead in that setting. That's foolishness, that's folly, it's negligence, and it's going to be expensive. And when people who have a proven worth are not allowed to lead or have influence, that is going to cost that country, that business, that household. Negligence in leadership is expensive for those being led. And when that happens, people suffer under a lack of competence. Here's an interesting thing. You know, the election's coming up. And we see, so much of these verses in these several chapters that we're in right now have to do with politics and leadership and all of those sorts of things. And in America, though, we know we're a representative republic, right? Not a pure democracy, but our founding fathers, in wisdom, set up this country as a representative republic. It's a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So, in this country, we are ultimately the ruler, and we are those who are being ruled. And so when we, as the ruler, make this error and put into place people who are not competent for those roles, or fail to put into place people who are competent for those roles, we make the mistake as the leader, and then we pay for it as those being ruled. The error and the pain is ours on both sides. It's painful, isn't it? Yeah. You're wondering if I'm going to tell you how to vote? Forget it. Stick to the gospel, friends. That's what this pulpit is for. Negligence is expensive, though. Then we get this series of proverbs that are about personal negligence, and that it's expensive for those who practice it. And so we're given this series of statements that is describing hazardous situations where caution is necessary, and if you're rash if you exercise folly there, you're going to be in a hurry and it's going to be costly to you. If you dig a pit, the pit's right next to you. You dug it, but if you're not careful, you're going to fall in it. That makes sense, right? That's like super simple. A serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. The idea is, it's like we would say in America, if you don't know why a fence was built, don't take it down. You never take a fence down unless you know why it was put up. That's proverbial wisdom, right? Here he's saying, if you don't know what's on the other side of that wall, you might want to be careful before you break through it, because you might get surprised, right? Then he says, he who quarries stones is hurt by them. He who splits logs is endangered by them. That's dangerous work. It requires caution. Then he gives us this one in verse 10. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. So we would say things like, work smarter, not harder. That's how we would say that. And there's some truth in that. It's the idea that, hey, as a professional in my vocation, I need to be a learner. I need to keep sharpening my tools so that I can, advance and all of that. But that's not actually what he's saying here. You know what he's saying? He's saying, if you don't sharpen your tools, you're going to have to swing harder. And the harder you swing, the more danger there is. Because you're not being cautious. You're just swinging. And that's when accidents happen. The harder you swing, the more dangerous it is. So, and then verse 11 is this idea that, there's such a thing as snake charmers, even in our day. And if the serpent bites before it is charmed, there's no advantage. The ESV here uses the word advantage, but we miss a little bit of the meaning because we would think the advantage here is a financial advantage. There's no profit to the charmer. So they're supposed to charm the snake, and people pay money to see him charm the snake, and it's all cool, and the snake comes up, and it's all charmed, and so he can handle it because it's charmed. But if he's in a hurry, and he's like wanting to make money, and so he tries to handle the snake before it's charmed, and it bites him, he doesn't get the money because everybody's like, you're a dope. You didn't even do what you're supposed to do. Think about life, right? Think about how many accidents and different things that happen because we're just in a hurry. Because we don't have time. I got to do all of those things. I just don't have time for that. And then, oh man, I should have known better. Negligence, it's expensive. Right? In life, often we learn these things the hard way. It's painful, isn't it? So whether in leadership or personally, negligence is expensive. It's part of folly. We see it. It undoes a lot of good. Now the third section, as we get to it, verses 12 through 15 are real interesting. This is how it reads. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. The final line here, you're like, what is that? What does that mean? He does not know the way to the city. It's a phrase that Solomon is using to describe somebody who is, we would say things like, he's not playing with a full deck of cards. Right? Or, the elevator's not going to the top floor there. Or I had an old friend that used to say, all his dogs don't bark. Or he just doesn't know to come in from out of the rain. He just doesn't know. He doesn't know his way to the city. Like he's saying, here's somebody who should know the most elementary things, and he doesn't know. He doesn't know. Why? Because he's a fool. How do you know he's a fool? By the way he runs his mouth. That's what he says. See, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor. When people utter wise things, people appreciate that and they honor that and it's great. But the fool, it says the lips of a fool consume him, so his own words are his ruin. You don't know what cannibalism is? We understand cannibalism where an animal eats its own kind. So I recently just realized, I came to know this. It's interesting. Did you know that rabbits are cannibals? They're sick little things. Like what? I mean, we think they're so cute, but they're nasty little things. They eat each other. I'm like, what? That's crazy. Little cannibals. Squirrels too, which I've never liked squirrels. But the fool goes further than that. It's one thing, twisted as it is, to be a cannibal. But there's this phenomenon called auto-cannibalism. And with auto-cannibalism, that creature doesn't just eat its own kind, it eats itself. Kind of creepy, right? Thankfully, it's rare, but a fool fits the category because it says the lips of a fool consume him. The word consume here means to swallow. So we typically think about what we consume as things that we take into our mouths and then we swallow it. But Solomon here gives us this sick, gross picture where the words of a fool, those are the things that come out of his mouth or her mouth. They come out of the mouth and they consume. He or she is swallowed up by them. They're his or her ruin. They're ruined by the things they say. Again, they don't know. There's an old saying, it's attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but it actually comes out of the Proverbs of the Bible. It's better to be silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. But the fool doesn't know that. He doesn't comprehend that. He thinks that he'll be listened to because he just keeps talking. Like look at verse 13. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness. Like he doesn't even start smart. He starts foolish. But the more he talks, the more imbecilic he shows himself to be. Right? The end of his talk is evil madness. So it starts out foolish, and then it just goes crazy from there, as if foolish wasn't crazy enough. He just keeps talking, and the more he talks, the more obvious it is that he does not know this way to the city. The more obvious it is that all his dogs don't bark. Right? Verse 14 shows us, this is great. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him. So the fool here is an expert on things that nobody comprehends. Put that together, friends. He's an expert on things that nobody understands the future. Nobody even can fully comprehend what's taking place in the present. Solomon's already told us that. A wise man who claims to know, he doesn't know. He's already told us that. And so here's the fool who nobody knows the future, but that's not going to stop him from giving a full explanation. It's poor judgment, and it's self-destructive, right? It's poor judgment, and it's self-destructive. But then we get to the last verse here, verse 15 in this section. And the toil of a fool wearies him. He refuses to embrace work as a normal part of life. And that's like indicative of a fool. He does not know. That's where Solomon, all the other things prove he doesn't know his way to the city. All of those other things prove that his elevator doesn't go all the way to the top. But here, the fact that he will not embrace work as a normal part of life, it's the nail in the coffin. Solomon says, we've read all the way through Ecclesiastes from start to finish, and we found out that it is our lot in life to work. And yes, there's a toil to it, but it's also the way we exercise our gifts. It's also the way God uses to meet our needs. It's also the way that God uses to bless other people. It's also the way that we find our sense of meaning in life, in part. Work is supposed to be embraced, and we're supposed to actually enjoy it, and we can by a gift from God. We've learned all of this, but to the fool, it's just tiresome. He's just tired of it. He's just weary of it all. And Solomon says, yeah, you don't know your way to the city. You don't even know to come in from out in the rain. Poor judgment. And it's self-destructive, right? It's what we see. He doesn't comprehend even the most elementary things. That's why I said last week or the week before, I can't remember, that when somebody who can work but won't, hasn't just lost their way, they've lost the way. Right? So poor judgment, self-destructive. Now, we get to our final section here, verses 16 through the end of the chapter. And here's how it goes. He says, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and when your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter." So here we see, okay, wisdom has its kryptonite, and it's folly. And folly here is immature. Folly is immature. And immaturity is hard to live with. It's hard to live with. That's true wherever you find it. But Solomon here gives us an example from the top. Remember, he's the king, and he says, "Woe to you, O land," to the people of a land, when your king is a child. When he's referring to childishness, right? He's going to tell us about maturity, that it matters, that priorities matter, and that discretion matters. Maturity, verses 16 and 17. When leaders are noble, he says people are happy. The people that they lead, when they're led with nobility, people are happy. But when immaturity exists in places of leadership, again, true in governments, true in households, true in churches, true in businesses, when leaders are immature, it's hard to live with them. He uses this word woe. It's not W-H-O-E, like woe, or O-A, not like woe like you'd pull on the reins of a horse. This is woe as in, I feel very sorry for you, right? He's saying it's an expression of intense hardship and pity. You're going to experience hardship, O land, when your king is a child, and I feel sorry for you. When leaders are immature, those who are led by them, it's painful. It's hard to live with them. This childishness is hard, right? Now, children are known for their cuteness, and they say funny things, and it's just wonderful. But there's a dark side to childhood as well. And anybody that's a parent recognizes that. And we love our kids, and we think they're wonderful and all of that. But we recognize that childishness is not actually pretty. And that's why we're supposed to exercise firm and loving discipline. Because folly, Proverbs says, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from them. So firm, loving discipline will break up that folly that's in their heart, that's bound up in their heart. And if we fail to do that, then they'll go into life with their heart bound up with folly. And we have to do, as parents, we have to do everything that we can to break up that folly and discard it so that they become responsible, respectable human beings. So because when a person is no longer a child and they're still acting childish, that's painful. It's hard to live with, right? Childishness is known, children are known for being self-centered. Along with being cute and all of those things, they're known for being self-centered. They don't know anything other than, I am the world, right? They don't know. They're nearsighted. They don't typically plan for the future. They lack self-control. They're self-indulgent, and that's why we're supposed to discipline them. But when people who are supposed to be grown up act like children, that folly, a little folly goes a long way, right? That's why it's hard to live with teenagers. So I'm told. What do I know? So I'm told. Now, I don't mean to make fun, because I love teenagers. I have some. But it is a challenge. And here's why it's a challenge. They are growing up. And we applaud every step of maturity that they take, and we're grateful to see the work of God in them. And they're forming their own values, and they're developing their own opinions about life and the way things work and all of that, and that's all very, very good. But as they start to grasp some things, they think they grasp everything. Yeah. Isn't that something? But they don't, but they're too immature to recognize it, right? It's challenging. They don't know that they haven't yet fully developed. And so it can be hard to live with. Folly is immature. But then we get this picture of nobility, because he's giving us an example from the top in leadership. And a son of the nobility, happy are you when your king is the son of the nobility. That was highly regarded in that day, because somebody who was a son of the nobility was brought up in an environment where they were exposed to complex, big issues. And from a very early age, they learned to think through those things and hear solutions and such. And so they were brought up in an environment that valued life beyond their own personal needs. If you were in that day a simple peasant, then you only had to be concerned with your own personal needs. And life was pretty simple. At times pretty hard, but it was pretty simple. But if you were a son of the nobility, you weren't just responsible for your own self, you were responsible for all the peasants. And if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, they all would suffer. And so happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, because those sons, those leaders were raised with a sense of honor and responsibility for others. So friends, those of you who are parents who still have children in your homes, raise your sons and your daughters to be the sons and daughters of nobility, so that they think beyond their own needs and can take on responsibilities that stretch beyond their own little worlds, so that they don't grow up to still be childish, but they grow up to be noble. Because immaturity is hard to live with. This is part of the reason why church elders are not supposed to be young in their faith or undeveloped in their maturity as human beings and spiritual maturity. It's why we're told in 1 Timothy 3 that anyone who aspires to be an overseer or an elder, he desires a noble task. There's nobility to it because an elder can't just think of themselves. So maturity matters. Priorities also matter. Look at this in these verses. Woe to you when your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you when your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. And then we get this little song. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens the heart, and money answers everything. So we get this crazy picture. Priorities are the things that are your first concern. What are your priorities? What are the things that are your first concern? See, a noble person knows that the morning is not the time for partying. The noble person knows that partying all night is unacceptable because they have responsibilities. If our first concern is ourselves, then we know we've got some growing up to do. Right? And when our primary concern is the next good time, we can be sure that our priorities are quite confused. In God's rhythm, which has been established through the book of Ecclesiastes, that we find outlined in all of Scripture, in God's rhythm in life, work always comes before rest. Rest is necessary, but it's only after one has worked. So if a person won't work, they don't deserve to rest. So there are some people in America whose children are supposed to be adults but are still acting like children. And they're not required to work. All they do is rest, thinking in some cases that video games is the real way to live. And parents, your job at that moment is to make life really hard for them to enjoy. If you're still making them sandwiches and paying for the internet for them to do that, you're missing it. You're setting them up for a lifetime of failure. If they can't get that straight, they are going to be wrecked the rest of their life. And if you're enabling it, Solomon's saying, whoa, that's really painful. Right? I told you, this is a tough one, isn't it? Verse 18, we get this picture of sloth, which is basically laziness. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. So, of course, a roof over one's head is a fundamental part of life, a necessity of life, and keeping it intact is a primary concern. It's a priority. So a sagging, leaking roof is a metaphor for the collapse of one's life due to laziness and misplaced priorities. And that can be true of businesses, and that can be true of countries. So priorities matter. And this word here in verse 19 that's translated answers is actually a musical term. And commentators think that verse 19 is the song that the lazy, misprioritized princes were singing while they're partying in the morning instead of governing righteously like they were supposed to. And they're singing their songs. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life. And money, when you see problems, you just throw money at it. We don't want to do the hard work. Let's just budget more for it. Interesting, isn't it? But then our last verse. So we talk about priority, that maturity matters, that priorities matter, and now we talk about discretion matters. Look at this last verse again. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king. Does that seem a little out of place? You're like, wait, what? How did he get to that? Nor in your bedroom curse the rich, because Alexa is listening. Don't think she's not either. Yeah. Discretion matters. So what is he saying? Remember, he's talking to his son, and he's talking to the subjects of his kingdom. And he says, when leaders act the way they're being described in verses 18 and 19, people are naturally are tempted to curse them. And Solomon says, don't do it. Even though everybody else seems to be, somebody who's noble and mature exercises discretion when it comes to how they talk about their leaders. Solomon says discretion matters. We are subject to our leaders, and we will answer to God for how we have guarded our hearts and our mouths concerning them, even when they're immature and foolish. That's a tough one, huh? Yeah. Let's be noble. So maturity matters, priorities matter, discretion matters. A little goes a long way when it comes to immaturity and misplaced priorities and indiscretions. So here we are at the end of chapter 10. Oh my, 14 weeks into Ecclesiastes, just a couple left, just 3 weeks left. And now we're finding some solutions, or he's putting things together here. He's talked so much about wisdom and how powerful and mighty and beneficial it is. But then he reminds us on the backside of that, it's kind of like Superman. So strong, so powerful, but it's got a vulnerability. In your own life, in my own life, it's got a vulnerability. Folly is wisdom's kryptonite. And if we're not careful, we could allow it to render us weaklings, right? Folly doesn't paint a pretty picture, does it? In its disregard of wisdom, it undoes a lot of good. In its negligence, it can be very expensive. In its poor judgment, it's self-destructive. And in its immaturity, it's hard to live with. This passage of Scripture is designed to scare us. It's meant to get us to go, oh man, I better quit goofing around. I better quit being lackadaisical about my standards. I better pay real close attention. I'm standing next to a hazardous situation here. I better lean to the right and guard myself, protect myself. Because a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Now, friends, here's the good news. Here's the good news. Though one sinner destroys much good, one righteous person has overcome all that folly outweighs. His name is Jesus Christ. And he is the Son of God. And he lived the perfect life that you and I haven't. He conquered our enemies. And he stands as the Savior of the world. He saves us from our sin. He saves us from our folly. And all of us have been foolish. And there stands Jesus. Aren't you glad for that? We're not left to ourselves. We stand before a righteous and holy God who holds us to a standard, and then he holds us up to the standard by his grace through his Son. Let's bow in prayer. This is such a beautiful time to say, hey, Lord, I've fallen prey to folly. And I stand before you confessing, asking for mercy. Think to yourself, are you doing anything that's undoing good? Are you flirting with anything that would undo good? Are you guarding yourself against your own vulnerability to folly? Are you being negligent to anything that requires your attention? Are you developing yourself as a child of nobility, or are you mostly just behaving childishly? If your primary concern is the next good time, if you don't work at the proper time, if your time and money are spent on only yourself, you're mostly acting childish. Don't be hard to live with. Father, thank you for the wisdom that you give us. The word tells us that we can seek wisdom. We can search for it and find it. The Lord gives wisdom. And from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. We know this, Lord. And now we're learning that wisdom has its own kryptonite. That we ourselves being prone to folly, Lord, we need you. We're dependent upon you. I pray for those who are suffering from folly, either from themselves or from others. I pray that you will give grace, Lord. Bring recovery and healing. Thank you for your mercy. I pray for those, Lord, who would need to be bolstered in their faith and trust in you and be guarded against folly. They've been tempted. They've been flirting. They've been playing around an open ditch. They've been messing around in hazardous places, Lord. I pray that you will give them wisdom and help them to guard against folly before the serpent bites. Much grace to your people today, Lord. Much grace. We love you, God. Amen. Amen. Love you, church.